I'll be honest, making this video about the Seattle Seahawks, I understand that if you're a fan of this team, this has been a hellish month and a half of an NFL season for you. It's been a hellish 6 to 7 months of being a Seattle Seahawks fan in terms of watching your team just be completely decimated by injuries, in terms of watching your team not make any moves to address its obvious weaknesses, and watching draft picks that you've had over the past 6 to 7 years amount to basically nothing for your franchise. Now, not only has Russell Wilson been, ruled out for at least a few weeks, even though he's probably going to beat that timeline just because it's Russell Wilson. You have names like Darrell Taylor, who has a terrifying injury on Sunday Night Football against the Pittsburgh Steelers. You have Chris Carson, who we have not seen in a few weeks. You just have some players who, it just injury-wise, it's a really unlucky team at the moment. And I should add that Darrell Taylor did avoid a really terrible injury for the Seattle Seahawks. It even sounds like he might play in Week 7 for the Seattle Seahawks. So that's really good to hear. We had a few injuries over this past week. Darrell Taylor was one of them. Taylor Lewan was another one for the Tennessee Titans, where you see a scary neck injury. Obviously something you never want to see. I'm not sure about the status on Taylor Lewan, but hearing that Darrell Taylor does have a chance to play in Week 7 does make me feel a lot better about the situation. Now, something that needs to be said about this Russell Wilson and Seattle Seahawks situation, and the overall point of this video is that, this era of Russell Wilson in Seattle and the whole John Schneider, Pete Carroll era in Seattle, let's be real, it's been a very successful 9-10 years of Russell Wilson being a Seattle Seahawk. He's been a Seattle Seahawk through and through. You see in his interviews, he always ends up with "Go Hawks." You see that wherever he's at, he represents the Seattle organization better than I think any player has ever represented the Seattle Seahawks ever. It's not a franchise that has a deep representation in terms of NFL history. You obviously have names like Steve Hutchinson. You have names like Walter Jones. You have names like Steve Largent. And many, many more who are very good and great names in terms of Seattle Seahawks history. But when you compare it to the NFL history, this is not an organization that, is in the blue bloods, I guess if you would say, when you talk about names like the San Francisco 49ers in their own division. Even the LA Rams in their own division, I would think, are a big name in NFL history. The Pittsburgh Steelers, the New England Patriots, many other teams around the NFL who are just, deeply ingrained in the history of the NFL. However, with Russell Wilson, he started to change that, alongside the Legion of Boom, who do deserve their fair share of credit for that Super Bowl win and for a majority of the success that they endured during the Russell Wilson era. However, when the Legion of Boom came and went, Russell Wilson didn't just get better. He became one of the best, if not the best, quarterbacks for a short period of time. And even though there's guys ahead of him right now, like maybe Patrick Mahomes or even Justin Herbert to an extent, or maybe, if you want to throw Lamar Jackson or Tom Brady, or if you want to throw a couple names in there, I would understand the argument. But there's no arguing that Russell Wilson has become one of, if not the best quarterbacks in the NFL. And to see him go down with an injury that we all knew was coming because of the fact that this front office and coaching staff did not put the proper offensive line help around him, honestly, it had been a long time coming for this franchise. And I will admit it, the front office for the Seattle Seahawks and the coaching staff for the Seattle Seahawks has done a lot more for their respective organizations than a lot of other front offices and coaching staffs can say they've ever done for their organization. Being able to bring a Seattle Super Bowl was one of the biggest accomplishments that we've seen in the past 15, 20 years in the NFL. There's not a lot of teams and coaching staffs and front offices that can say they've done what the Seattle Seahawks have done in this 10-year span. They haven't had a losing record with Russell Wilson as the quarterback. Russell Wilson, you have to remember, the Seattle Seahawks were going to give this, the keys to this organization to Matt Flynn when they drafted Russell Wilson. Matt Flynn was going to be the guy in Seattle. Imagine where the Seahawks would be if Russell Wilson did not come along and Matt Flynn, flamed out after a year and a half of mediocre quarterback play. Imagine where we'd be with the Seahawks. There wouldn't be any DK Metcalf in Seattle, that's for sure. Marshawn Lynch wouldn't have been the name he was in Seattle, that's for sure. The Legion of Boom probably never would have came along because, honestly, because of Russell Wilson. This team has its notoriety in the NFL right now because of Russell Wilson. And at this point, I think they need to do the right thing and let him move on to greener pastures and trade him to a team that can actually support him with draft picks and free agent signings. The Seattle Seahawks have done a lot to try to keep their own Legion of Boom or their own version of the great defense that they used to have, during that era of the Legion of Boom. But let's be honest, they have one of the worst defenses in the NFL, and that's including trying to keep one of the best defenses in the NFL. They've tried so hard with draft picks like Jordan Brooks, with free agent signings like, I guess they traded for Carlos Dunlap, but you know what I'm saying. Like, they've tried so hard. And the fact of the matter is, you can't replicate a defense that featured names like Cam Chancellor. You don't get another Cam Chancellor. You don't get another Earl Thomas. You don't get another Richard Sherman. They still have Bobby Wagner, but you don't get another KJ Wright. You don't get another Michael Bennett. You don't get another Bruce Irvin. That team can never be replicated. That team can never have any of its players duplicated. And when you try again to do it, you see where we're at this point with the Seattle Seahawks of having one of the worst defenses, not only just right now in the NFL, but it's one of the worst defenses we've seen in a long time. And it gets even worse when you think about the fact that the Seattle Seahawks traded their current, this year's first round pick for Jamal Adams last year. And not only is Jamal Adams maybe I don't understand how Jamal Adams has as bad of an ability to catch a football as he does. He's not a good tackler. He'll hit you hard. He's not a good tackler. He's terrible in coverage. He can't man up a tight end, even though he's definitely faster than any tight end he's going to line up against. I don't know what Jamal Adams does other than, okay, yeah, he'll blitz, but if a lineman gets his hands on Jamal Adams, then it means nothing. And that's what they wasted the first round pick on. Jamal Adams doesn't have a sack this year. He doesn't have an interception in 2 years. He just is not a positive player for this defense. And that's just honestly the constant when you look at most of the players on the Seahawks defense. Now, the Seattle Seahawks rarely use first-round picks in the first place. They usually trade out of the first round or at least trade very low into the first round. And you can see by some of the players that they've drafted in the past 5 or 6 years, it's really confusing. You see, they use their top draft pick, the 56th overall pick, on a wide receiver in Dwayne Eskridge. I understand he was a good player at Western Michigan, but what is he going to do when there's players by the name of DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Freddie Swain? I think even Tommy Hart is ahead of him on the depth chart. I don't think Dwayne Eskridge is really doing anything in the punt or kick return game. That's a whole nother issue why DJ Dallas is the kick returner, but at the same time, that's just a wasted pick. And then you go on to see other names like Jordan Brooks, first-round pick, good player out of Texas Tech. At the time, you have Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright for a defense that usually just uses 2 linebackers. What's necessarily the point of Jordan Brooks, And it goes back even deeper. LJ Collier has been a bust for the Seattle Seahawks. As there's just no getting around it. Rashad Penny, bust. Malik McDowell, he was going to be a good player for the Seattle Seahawks. He had, I believe it was a car accident that kind of, took him out for a year or two, but he's back in the NFL right now, and he's doing some decent things at that defensive tackle spot. Jermaine Ifedi, probably one of the worst offensive linemen I've ever seen with my own 2 eyes. Jermaine Ifedi is terrible. And this is just some of the names we've seen taken by this front office and coaching staff in the draft. That does not even get to the tip of the iceberg of some of the terrible moves that have been made over the past few years by the Seahawks. At the end of the day, I think this Seahawks team just kind of needs to hit the reset button because, they don't have any semblance of a running game right now. None at all. Even if Russell Wilson was still playing, I don't think they'd even come close to having a good running game. This team really just relied on the shoulders of Russell Wilson. And if he's not playing at the top of his capabilities, or if he's not on the field at all, this team is nothing. Even when he was on the field, this team pretty much was nothing. They weren't going to win that game against the Rams, even if Russell Wilson did finish the game. They maybe weren't even going to beat Pittsburgh if he plays in Pittsburgh, because Pittsburgh's defense is that good. I don't think TJ Watt sacked Geno Smith because it was Geno Smith. I think TJ Watt got those sacks against Geno Smith because he's that good. TJ Watt is maybe the best defensive player in the NFL right now. The Russell Wilson-led Seahawks era is more than likely coming to an end. And not only does it involve Russell Wilson probably being shipped off to a different organization, it involves Pete Carroll leaving. It involves maybe a shakeup in the front office with John Schneider as the general manager. It involves just a fire sale. And, the Seattle Seahawks get to go out on top because they did win a Super Bowl with this era. This is a lot better era than Seattle Seahawks are accustomed to. And it's a lot better of an era than their fans are accustomed to. Like I said, this franchise was going to be entrusted with Matt Flynn at the helm. And Russell Wilson came along and saved this franchise. And they need to do the right thing by him and let him go be successful somewhere else. With all that being said, that's going to be the video from me. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you leave a like. If you didn't, make sure you leave a dislike. Any feedback from you at this point is much appreciated. And I'll see you in the next video. Peace.